Is there any way we can get capital knocked off? The voice on the interrogation tape trembles slightly, measured but defensive. Dennis Bowman, age 70, sits across from Detective Jonathan Smith in the Allegan County Sheriff's Office. The detective has removed his badge, a calculated psychological move to lower Dennis's guard. Between them lies not just a table, but 3 decades of buried secrets. A sexual experience is not one that you forget, the detective says evenly. It's just not drunk or not drunk. I don't ever remember having sex with that woman, Dennis insists, his voice gaining an edge. Well, you did. Your DNA was in her. This is where our story begins, at the end. Or rather, at one of many ends in a case that twisted through 4 decades, 2 states, and countless lives shattered beyond repair. Because Dennis Bowman's arrest on this November day in 2019 wasn't for what everyone in Hamilton, Michigan thought it would be. It was for a woman named Kathleen Doyle, murdered 700 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia in 1980. But hidden beneath that murder confession lies another, darker, closer to home, and 30 years in the making. The question that haunted investigators: if Dennis could kill a stranger with such brutality, what happened to the 14-year-old girl who vanished from his own home in 1989? The daughter he reported as a runaway. The daughter whose face appeared on MTV, frozen in time. The daughter named Aundria. To understand this story, we must travel backward through time, peeling away layers of deception like old wallpaper hiding rot beneath. This isn't just a tale of murder, it's a story of adoption and abandonment, of mothers who gave up children hoping for better lives, only to discover they delivered them into the hands of a monster. Let's begin our journey not at the beginning, but at the moment when the truth finally cracked open. November 2019. The Bowman residence, Salem Township, Michigan. Dennis and Brenda Bowman walk through the front door of the Allegan County Sheriff's Office with righteous indignation written across their faces. They're here to file a formal complaint against a woman named Kathy Turkanian, who has been, in their words, harassing them online, making wild accusations about Dennis's involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The investigators listen sympathetically. They offer Dennis a bottle of water. He accepts. This is the moment everything changes. Dennis drinks, vents his frustrations, and eventually leaves, that plastic bottle still gripped in his hand until he sets it down. The investigators don't discard it. They bag it. They send it to a lab in Virginia where it's compared against DNA extracted from a bedsheet that's been waiting in evidence storage since September 1980. The match comes back positive, with odds of 1 in several billion. Dennis Bowman's arrest followed a major breakthrough when forensic evidence linked him to the rape and murder of Kathleen Doyle in Norfolk, Virginia. The trap had been set not by Michigan authorities investigating Aundria's disappearance, but by cold case detectives 700 miles away who had never stopped searching for Kathleen Doyle's killer. But how did they get Dennis's name? The answer lies in a revolution sweeping through law enforcement: genetic genealogy. In 2018, Norfolk Cold Case Unit Detective Jonathan Smith turned to genetic genealogy, sending DNA samples preserved on a bed sheet from Kathleen's house to a genealogy company. After a year of painstaking analysis, investigators received a list of 32 names, distant relatives forming branches of a genetic family tree. At the center, Dennis Lee Bowman. Detective Smith had never heard the name. But when he began researching Bowman's background, alarm bells screamed. Here was a man with a documented history of violence against women. Here was a man whose military records placed him in Norfolk during the exact time frame of Kathleen's murder. And here, most chillingly, was a man whose 14-year-old daughter had vanished without a trace in 1989. At a national cold case seminar in 2019, Norfolk detectives shared their suspect list with Michigan law enforcement, who were already familiar with Dennis Bowman's criminal history. The collaboration between departments became the key that would unlock not 1, but 2 cold cases. The DNA evidence was overwhelming. But Dennis's confession, when it finally came, revealed a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of deception, even to himself. Sitting in that interrogation room, Detective Smith employs a technique that seems almost gentle. He asks Dennis about his childhood, his parents, his fascination with knives. He's building rapport, brick by psychological brick. Dennis gradually opened up, admitting he'd been in Norfolk for military training and describing his decision to break into a home after drinking at a bar. His version of events is sanitized, clinical. He portrays himself as a man overwhelmed by circumstance rather than choice. According to Dennis, he entered Kathleen's home looking for money. When she screamed, he covered her mouth, accidentally stabbing her when she grabbed his hand. He claims he left immediately while she was still moving on the bed. The autopsy tells a different story, one of strangulation, multiple stab wounds, sexual assault, and calculated brutality. When confronted with these facts, Dennis shuts down. He can't remember. Or won't. Then comes a moment that chills everyone watching the tape. Dennis begins talking about a demon, an entity with horns and a pointed beard that takes him over. He draws it on a notepad. His demeanor shifts, becoming almost childlike, as if he's watching himself from outside his own body. When Detective Smith leaves the room, cameras capture Dennis muttering to himself, initially whispering, "I didn't do it," before abruptly changing to, "I did it again. I did it again. Again." That single word opens the floodgates. Because if Dennis killed Kathleen Doyle in 1980, what did he do 9 years later when his daughter threatened to tell counselors he'd been molesting her? With Dennis facing life imprisonment in Virginia, Michigan investigators see their window closing. Once he's extradited, they'll lose all leverage. They need to know what happened to Aundria Bowman. They offer him a deal. Tell us where she is, and you can serve your time in Michigan, where your wife can visit. Refuse, and you'll die alone in a Virginia prison, cut off from your family forever. Dennis initially resists but eventually agrees to confess, though only in a supervised meeting with his wife Brenda. He checks to ensure the cameras are recording. This performance is for posterity. When Brenda enters the room, Dennis delivers a story carefully crafted to minimize his guilt. He claims Aundria died accidentally when he pushed her during an argument, and she fell down the stairs after threatening to report his abuse. Panicking, he wrapped her in a blanket and hid her in the barn before reporting her missing. He tells Brenda he disposed of the body in the neighbor's trash, believing it was incinerated at a landfill. Brenda weeps. But her response reveals the tragic enabling that allowed Dennis to operate for decades. "I forgive you. I still love you." Investigators don't believe him. The story is too convenient, too clean. They begin monitoring his jail correspondence with Brenda, and their suspicions are confirmed. In letters, Dennis contradicts himself, eventually writing that he buried Aundria in a private cemetery, and describing her burial clothes in haunting detail. He mentioned walking past her burial site more than 100 times over 30 years. When confronted again, Dennis admits the truth. He had buried Aundria in the backyard of their rental home on Lincoln Road. But when the family moved to their new property on 134th Avenue, he did something almost incomprehensible. He exhumed her remains in the darkness and reburied them at the new house. He moved his victim with him. Kept her close. Maintained control even over her bones. February 2020. The Bowman property on 134th Avenue. Police return with excavators to the exact spot Dennis identified, which eerily matched a disturbed patch of earth that Aundria's biological mother had flagged years earlier using Google Earth, a detail investigators had dismissed at the time as maternal desperation. The excavation reveals a shallow grave. Inside, a large trash bag containing 4 smaller bags. The contents are calculated to deceive, used diapers placed strategically to mask the scent of decomposition from cadaver dogs. Buried alongside the remains, a candy wrapper dated 1989, a time capsule from the year Aundria vanished. DNA analysis confirmed the identity of the remains as Aundria Bowman. The girl who disappeared at 14 had been in the backyard all along, less than 100 feet from where Dennis ate breakfast, mowed the lawn, and played with his surviving daughter. 30 years of normalcy built on top of murder. Even after this discovery, Brenda tells Dennis over the phone, "Nothing has changed. I still love you." April 2010. Virginia. A letter arrives at Kathy Turkanian's home explaining that her biological daughter, whom she had named Alexis and placed for adoption as an infant, had disappeared from her adoptive home in Michigan in 1989. For Kathy, now in her late 40s, this revelation is both devastating and bewildering. She hadn't even known her daughter's name had been changed to Aundria Bowman. The last time she saw Alexis, the baby was 9 months old, surrendered to the adoption system in a desperate attempt to give her the stability Kathy couldn't provide. The letter explains that Aundria might be a Jane Doe found in a Wisconsin cornfield in 1999. Would Kathy be willing to provide DNA? She agrees immediately, though the request opens wounds she thought had scarred over. Kathy goes online and finds Aundria's school photo, the image that appeared in Soul Asylum's Runaway Train music video. Green eyes gazing slightly upward, frozen at 14 forever. Kathy feels an instant connection, but she needs to understand who raised her daughter. She reaches out to a retired Michigan detective named Pat O'Reilly, seeking reassurance about the family she'd entrusted with her child's future. O'Reilly offers no comfort. Instead, he points her toward Dennis Bowman's criminal history, a documented trail of violence stretching back decades. Kathy files a Freedom of Information Act request and receives documents that dismantle the image of the Bowman family as pious churchgoers. The files reveal a predator operating in plain sight. A 27-year-old woman is bound, gagged, and assaulted by an intruder in her Holland home on a Sunday morning. Dennis Bowman confesses years later. The victim's terror is immortalized in a police sketch showing a man with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses. A 19-year-old woman cycling near Holland is forced off the road by a motorcyclist who commands her to walk into the woods, then fires his gun twice when she refuses. A passing car provides her chance to escape. Within hours, police detain Dennis Bowman. He's convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct and sentenced to 5 to 10 years, though he serves only the minimum. The files note that a judge determined Dennis would likely pose a danger to women if free. Yet he was released in 1986, when Aundria was 11 years old. A state trooper responds to an alarm at Vicky Vanden Brink's mobile home and finds Dennis walking away from the back door. Vicky has been plagued by break-ins. The sheriff installed a security system specifically because of them. Dennis lies, claiming he's staying with Vicky temporarily. When she contradicts him, he changes his story. He only entered to use the bathroom. A search of his property reveals a black duffel bag containing Vicky's stolen lingerie, a short-barreled shotgun, and a mask. Dennis admits to stalking Vicky, breaking in to steal underwear, and cutting a slit in her curtains so he could watch her. Before sentencing, 1 year in jail, 5 years probation, Dennis writes to the judge portraying himself as a devoted father of 2 daughters, aged 25 and 11. He conveniently neglects to mention that the 25-year-old hasn't been seen in a decade. Character references pour in from his Catholic church. Father Michael O'Connell writes a detailed letter praising Dennis's exemplary character and contributions to charity drives, arguing that imprisoning such a dedicated community member would harm the church and community. Most people vouching for Dennis have no idea who they're defending. But there's another document in those files, one that haunts Kathy more than all the violence that came before. 14-year-old Aundria confides in a teacher that she's afraid to go home because her father is abusing her. A social worker visits the Bowman residence. Dennis and Brenda vehemently deny the accusation, claiming Aundria only recently learned she was adopted and is acting out in rebellion. The social worker accepts this explanation. The report is filed and forgotten. Aundria is allowed to remain in the home, and police conduct no further investigation. 4 months later, she disappears. Kathy realizes with crushing clarity that the system designed to protect children failed her daughter. Aundria reached out. She asked for help. And the adults who could have saved her chose to believe a predator over a frightened child. While Kathy is learning about her daughter's fate, another person is piecing together the puzzle from a completely different direction. Carl Koppelman is a cold case enthusiast who frequents Web Sleuths, an online forum where hobbyists collaborate on unsolved cases. Carl creates lifelike renderings of Jane and John Does based on postmortem photos, posting them online hoping to spark recognition. His focus turns to the Racine County Jane Doe, a young woman found in 1999 near Wisconsin cornfield, dead approximately 12 hours, with evidence suggesting long-term abuse and neglect. The autopsy revealed a history of broken bones and a cauliflower ear. More than 50 people from the farming community attended her funeral, mourning a stranger. Carl filters through the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, gender, age, location. Most entries lead nowhere. But one stops him cold, Aundria Bowman. The timeline aligns. The geography makes sense. Holland, Michigan sits directly across Lake Michigan from where the Jane Doe was found, only a 4-hour drive around the southern tip of the lake. If Aundria survived as a runaway for a decade before dying in 1999, the match is compelling. Carl presents his theory to law enforcement, who agree it's worth investigating. To confirm the link, they need DNA from Aundria's biological mother, which is how that letter arrives at Kathy's door in April 2010. September 2013. The Missing in Michigan Conference. DNA results finally return. Kathy is not related to the Racine County Jane Doe. The hope that Aundria lived for a decade after 1989 evaporates. But it strengthens Kathy's conviction that Dennis murdered her daughter and she never left Ottawa County. Kathy and Carl attend the conference wearing custom shirts. Find Aundria Bowman. As Carl scans the room, he spots two familiar faces and nudges Kathy. That's Vanessa, he says, pointing to the red-haired daughter born in 1988. And that's Brenda. Brenda recognizes Kathy from Facebook, where Kathy has been publicly stating her belief that Dennis is responsible. Brenda approaches, defensive and eager to protect her husband's reputation. She produces a binder of notes and flyers as proof they cooperated fully in 1989. When Carl gently presses about Dennis's criminal record, Brenda's response is chilling in its unwavering loyalty. I haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously. With Brenda standing as a firewall between truth and justice, the Michigan investigation stalls. Dennis remains free, protected by a wife's forgiveness and the absence of physical evidence. But the breakthrough isn't in Michigan. It's waiting in Norfolk, Virginia, in a cold case file from 1980. Let's step back to the day everything changed. March 11th, 1989 was an unremarkable Saturday in Holland, Michigan. Frost thawing on water towers, children watching cartoons, fathers driving to weekend shifts. Spring was just over a week away. But at the corner of Lincoln Road and 52nd Street, the Bowman household was fracturing. Dennis drives 14-year-old Aundria to school for a band event. When he picks her up that afternoon, the atmosphere in the car is heavy with unspoken tension. That evening, he drives Brenda to her second shift, taking baby Vanessa with him so Aundria can focus on homework. When Dennis returns around 6:30 p.m., the farmhouse is dark. Silent. The back door is unlocked. He places Vanessa on the sofa and calls out for Aundria. No answer. He walks upstairs to the master bedroom, a door usually kept strictly locked, and finds it open. Inside, a small travel suitcase is missing. Cash from their recent tax refund, gone. Even coins from Vanessa's piggy bank have disappeared. When Brenda's shift ends at 11:30 p.m., she comes home to the news that her daughter has vanished. Dennis contacts police and paints a picture of a troubled teenager who frequently fought with her mother and had run away to a friend's house before. The missing money and suitcase suggest a runaway. Police label the case accordingly and pass it to the Youth Services Bureau. Few question the narrative. Many in Holland assume Aundria grew fed up with her strict home life and left. Rumors fill the void. She's searching for her birth mother. She hitched a ride at a truck stop. She left with an older boy. She's pregnant. Shortly after the disappearance, the Bowmans moved from a farmhouse on Lincoln Road to Hamilton, leaving the empty room and rumors behind. But there's a detail Dennis doesn't share with anyone. He later admits using an axe to dismember Aundria's body so it would fit in a barrel, which he buried in the backyard. When the family moves, he returns under cover of darkness to exhume and relocate her remains. Aundria never ran away. She never made it past her own backyard. In 1993, Aundria's photograph appears in the music video for Soul Asylum's Runaway Train, shown on MTV among other missing children. The video becomes a cultural phenomenon. Director Tony Kaye later claims more than 24 missing children were found because of the broadcast. Aundria isn't one of them. The song fades from the charts. The video stops airing. Her case goes cold, buried under the assumption that a rebellious teenager simply chose to disappear. For 2 decades, the case remains dormant, until Carl Koppelman begins searching databases in 2010, and Kathy Turkanian receives a letter that reopens wounds she thought would never heal. To understand Aundria's story, we must begin with 2 mothers and the choices they made out of love. 15-year-old Kathy Turkanian gives birth to a healthy daughter she names Alexis Miranda Badger. Kathy herself is barely more than a child. She ran away from her Virginia home at age 12, hitchhiking to Memphis where she met Randy Badger, 19. They married in South Carolina under laws allowing minors to wed with parental permission. Kathy's parents provided it gladly, eager to shed legal responsibility for their daughter. The marriage is brief and unstable. When Kathy discovers she's pregnant, Randy is already drifting away. By the time Alexis is 5 months old, they've separated. Kathy returns to her parents' home in Virginia, seeking a safety net that doesn't exist. She receives no financial or emotional support. At 15, she's a child raising a baby in a house that doesn't want either of them. When Alexis is 9 months old, Kathy makes an agonizing choice. She surrenders her daughter to the adoption system in Norfolk, Virginia. It's a closed adoption, a final legal door shutting between mother and child. Kathy walks away clinging to a fragile hope. One day, when Alexis is grown, she'll come looking for her mother. Dennis and Brenda Bowman are searching for a child to complete their family. They present themselves as pillars of stability, church-going, hardworking, devoted. Dennis is a former Navy reservist turned wood machinist with reddish-brown hair, a goatee, and wire-rimmed glasses. Brenda, heavy-set with curled bangs, previously worked the jewelry counter at the local Meijer department store. They teach Sunday school. They keep up appearances. They desperately want to be parents. But Brenda suffers from uterus didelphys, a rare congenital condition involving a double uterus that makes pregnancy extremely difficult. After years of disappointment, they turn to adoption agencies. The system matches them with Kathy's infant daughter. Before Alexis's first birthday, her identity vanishes. She becomes Aundria Michelle Bowman, the daughter of Dennis and Brenda, growing up in the quiet religious stability of rural Michigan. It's the life Kathy dreamed of for her child. It's also a nightmare Kathy could never have imagined. For nearly 14 years, Aundria is the sole focus of the Bowman household. But in January 1988, the dynamic shifts dramatically when Brenda carries a pregnancy to term and delivers a healthy daughter named Vanessa. Aundria goes from being an only child to essentially becoming a third parent, responsible for changing diapers, washing bottles, and tending to the baby. While other girls her age join after-school clubs and attend football games, Aundria spends afternoons and weekends at home performing childcare duties. Whispers begin circulating about the Bowman home. In middle school, students notice blood on Aundria's wrist when she boards the bus. Some whisper she attempted suicide. Others claim she cut herself climbing back into the house through a window after Dennis and Brenda locked her out. There are stories about Dennis's temper, about suffocating control. But this is 1980s rural Michigan, where what happens behind closed doors is dismissed as private family business. No one questions a church-going family. Then comes November 1988. Aundria tells a teacher she's afraid to go home because her father is abusing her. A social worker visits. Dennis and Brenda deny everything, claiming Aundria recently learned she was adopted and is acting out. The social worker believes them. The report is filed. No investigation follows. 4 months later, Aundria is gone. The girl who asked for help. The girl who was ignored. The girl who never stood a chance. September 1980. Norfolk, Virginia. 25-year-old Kathleen O'Brien Doyle has been married to Navy pilot Stephen Doyle for only 5 months when duty calls him to deploy aboard the USS Eisenhower. Kathleen remains in their small home with her orange tabby cat, accustomed to the solitude of being a serviceman's wife. By September, that solitude turns ominous. Friends realize they haven't seen or heard from Kathleen in quite some time. Concerned, they go to her house to check on her. What they find is a scene of absolute horror. Kathleen lies dead in her bedroom, bound and gagged, the room ransacked in a violent frenzy. The autopsy reveals she was strangled, stabbed multiple times across her body, and brutally raped. Time of death: sometime between 7:30 p.m. and midnight. Her body lay undiscovered until noon on September 11th. With no witnesses and little physical evidence, the investigation stalls. It remains cold until 1984 when Henry Lee Lucas, a death row inmate who confessed to murdering his own mother, provides investigators with a list of hundreds of women he claims to have killed. Among them, Kathleen Doyle. The Norfolk Police Department flies to Texas to interview Lucas. He's convincing, offering details that seem to connect him to the crime scene. Police prepare to charge both Lucas and his accomplice with murder. Then Lucas recants, admitting he fabricated the entire confession to make them look like fools. The case goes cold again. DNA has been collected from the scene, preserved on a bed sheet, but it's 1984. The technology to use it doesn't exist yet. The silence lasts nearly 4 decades, until genetic genealogy gives Kathleen Doyle's murder new life in 2018. Here's what investigators eventually pieced together. In September 1980, Dennis Bowman is in Norfolk for a 2-week Navy Reserve training drill. Court transcripts later confirm his presence in Norfolk during the exact window of Kathleen's murder. This is 3 months after he committed the assault on the cyclist in Michigan, the crime for which he won't be sentenced until 1981. Dennis is free. He's dangerous. And he's 700 miles from anyone who knows his history. According to his eventual confession, Dennis leaves the Navy base to clear his head, visits a bar, and becomes heavily intoxicated. He wanders streets until he spots a house with lights off and no car in the driveway, Kathleen's home while her husband is deployed. Dennis enters looking for money. Kathleen screams. He covers her mouth and, according to his sanitized version, accidentally stabs her when she grabs his hand. The physical evidence tells a different story: ligature marks from strangulation, a burn mark on her face, defensive wounds on her hands, and evidence of prolonged sexual assault. This isn't an accident. It's a sustained, sadistic attack. When Detective Smith confronts Dennis with these facts in 2019, Dennis shuts down. He draws his demon on a notepad, a creature with horns taking him over. He becomes almost childlike, as if watching himself from outside his body. But when the detective leaves the room, cameras capture Dennis's whispered confession: "I did it again. I did it again." On February 7, 2022, Dennis pleads no contest to second-degree murder regarding Aundria. The judge remarks that in decades of service, few cases were as disturbing. Dennis receives a minimum of 35 years and maximum of 50. The plea deal's arrangement means he first serves time in Michigan before being transferred to Virginia to formally receive 2 life sentences for Kathleen's murder. He'll never walk free. Brenda claims Aundria's remains and has them cremated, then offers half the ashes to Kathy, a gesture Kathy finds devastating, a final act of partition splitting her daughter in half just as Dennis did in life. For Kathy, it's a heartbreaking end to a mother's search. She gave Alexis up decades earlier hoping to provide a better life, only to find her daughter too late to save her. Today, Dennis Bowman, age 75, is incarcerated at the River North Correctional Center in Virginia. Brenda remains married to him and resides in Michigan with their daughter Vanessa. The farmhouse on Lincoln Road and the property on 134th Avenue stand as silent witnesses to a 30-year secret. And the full extent of Dennis's crimes may never be fully known. Investigators have identified other unsolved cases they believe Bowman should be investigated for, including the 1977 murder of 20-year-old Deborah Polinsky, who was found sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in her Holland home. How many other women? How many other victims whose cases remain cold, whose families still search for answers? Dennis admitted to sexual assaults in San Diego before and during his marriage to Brenda. He confessed to an attack in a trailer park in the early 1980s. But beyond what he's acknowledged, investigators suspect there are more, women whose names we don't know, whose stories remain buried. This story isn't just about Dennis Bowman's depravity. It's about the catastrophic failures of systems designed to protect the vulnerable. Kathy Turkanian was 15 when she surrendered Alexis, hoping to give her daughter stability. The closed adoption meant Kathy had no way to check on her child's well-being, no legal standing to intervene. When Aundria disappeared in 1989, Kathy didn't even know her daughter's new name. When Aundria reported abuse in November 1988, a social worker visited once, accepted the Bowman's denial, and closed the case. No follow-up. No investigation. 4 months later, Aundria was dead. Dennis was convicted of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct in 1980 and sentenced to 5 to 10 years. A judge determined he would pose a danger to women if free. Yet he served only the minimum sentence and was released in 1986, when Aundria was 11 years old and living in his home. In 1998, when Dennis was caught breaking into Vicky Vanden Brink's trailer with a duffel bag containing her stolen underwear, a shotgun, and a mask, after admitting to stalking her and cutting slits in her curtains to watch her, he received 1 year in jail and 5 years probation. Character references from his church helped secure leniency. The pattern was clear. Dennis committed escalating acts of violence. The system gave him chance after chance. And women paid the price. The Bowmans were pillars of their congregation, teaching Sunday school and volunteering for charity drives. When whispers circulated about what happened behind closed doors, about Aundria's cut wrists, about Dennis's temper, the community chose not to question a church-going family. Even Father Michael O'Connell, who wrote a glowing character reference for Dennis after the Vanden Brink break-in, praised his exemplary character without knowing the full truth of who he was defending. Of all the people in this story, perhaps none is more remarkable than Kathy Turkanian, Aundria's birth mother who refused to stop fighting even when every system told her to give up. When Kathy received that letter in 2010 explaining that her daughter might be a Jane Doe in Wisconsin, she could have provided DNA and walked away. Instead, she dove into the case with relentless determination. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She connected with cold case enthusiasts like Carl Koppelman. She studied satellite imagery on Google Earth and identified the exact patch of disturbed Earth where Aundria would eventually be found, years before police took her seriously. She attended the Missing in Michigan conference wearing a shirt with her daughter's name, confronting Brenda Bowman face-to-face. She posted on social media, making accusations that led the Bowmans to file harassment complaints against her, complaints that ironically gave investigators the opportunity to collect Dennis's DNA from a water bottle. When law enforcement dismissed her theories as maternal desperation, Kathy kept pushing. And she was right. The excavation site on 134th Avenue matched the location Kathy had identified years earlier. Her intuition, dismissed by investigators who said she had no legal standing since the adoption severed her parental rights, was validated when her daughter's remains were unearthed from that exact spot. Kathy never got to raise Alexis. She never got to protect Aundria. But in death, she became her daughter's fiercest advocate, the one person who refused to let her vanish into history as just another runaway. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is Vanessa Bowman, the daughter born in January 1988, who grew up in a house where her sister's remains were buried in the backyard. Vanessa was 14 months old when Aundria disappeared. She has no memories of her sister. She grew up with Dennis and Brenda's version of events. Aundria was a troubled teenager who ran away. When Vanessa attended the Missing in Michigan conference in 2013 with her mother, she was supporting what she believed was her parents' genuine search for a lost sister. When Dennis was arrested in 2019, Vanessa's entire understanding of her family shattered. Her father wasn't just a convicted criminal who'd served time decades ago. He was a serial predator and murderer. Her mother wasn't a devoted wife standing by her husband. She was an enabler who chose loyalty over truth, who told Dennis, "I still love you," even after he admitted to killing Aundria and moving her body. And the sister Vanessa never knew. She'd been buried less than 100 feet from where Vanessa played as a child. The psychological impact is almost incomprehensible. How do you reconcile loving a father with knowing he's a monster? How do you process that your childhood home was built on a grave? Vanessa has largely remained out of the public eye since Dennis's conviction, and that's understandable. She's a victim in this story too, perhaps not in the same way as Aundria or Kathleen or Kathy, but a victim nonetheless of Dennis's deception and Brenda's complicity. Perhaps the most controversial figure in this entire story is Brenda Bowman, a woman whose steadfast loyalty raises more questions than it answers. When Dennis was arrested in 2019, Brenda's first instinct was denial. "You've got the wrong person. He would never do something like that." When confronted with his criminal record, her response was, "I haven't forgotten what he did, but I do forgive him. I take my marriage vows very seriously." When Dennis confessed to killing Aundria, Brenda wept, then told him she forgave him and still loved him. Even after police discovered Aundria's remains in the backyard where Brenda had lived for decades, she remained married to Dennis. She visits him in prison. She has never publicly condemned his actions. This raises profound questions. What did Brenda know, and when did she know it? Did she truly believe Aundria ran away in 1989? Or did she suspect the truth but chose to protect Dennis over seeking justice for her daughter? When Aundria reported abuse in November 1988, Brenda vehemently denied it alongside Dennis. Was she protecting a husband she believed was innocent, or protecting a predator she knew was guilty? In 1998, when police found stolen lingerie in Dennis's outbuilding after he was caught breaking into Vicky Vanden Brink's trailer, Brenda provided a character reference. Did she truly believe her husband was a good man making mistakes, or was she complicit in minimizing his crimes? Some view Brenda as a victim herself, a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, conditioned to defend her abuser. Others see her as an enabler whose loyalty allowed Dennis to operate freely, whose refusal to acknowledge his nature contributed to decades of violence. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, in the complicated psychology of intimate partnerships where love, fear, denial, and self-preservation tangle into something almost impossible to unravel from the outside. What's clear is this: Brenda chose Dennis over Aundria. She chose to forgive rather than demand justice. And that choice has consequences that echo through this story like a scream in an empty house. Despite Dennis's confessions and convictions, mysteries remain. Dennis claims Aundria fell down the stairs during an argument on March 11, 1989. But medical examiners couldn't determine cause of death from the remains. Did Dennis kill Aundria in a moment of rage, or was it premeditated murder? Did she really threaten to report his abuse again, or is that just another lie to justify the unjustifiable? Dennis admitted to sexual assaults in San Diego and Michigan beyond what he's been charged with. Investigators suspect he may be connected to other unsolved cases, including the 1977 murder of Deborah Polinsky. How many other women encountered Dennis Bowman and didn't survive? Dennis's decision to exhume Aundria's remains and move them to the new property is almost unprecedented in criminal psychology. Why take such an enormous risk? Was it about control, maintaining dominance over his victim even in death? Was it paranoia, fear that new owners of the Lincoln Road property would discover the grave? Or was it something more twisted, a need to keep Aundria close, to walk past her burial site and know he'd gotten away with murder? Perhaps the biggest question: did Brenda know? When Dennis returned home on March 11, 1989, claiming Aundria had run away, did Brenda believe him? When he later moved the body to their new property, did she help? Did she see him digging in the backyard and choose not to ask questions? Or was she truly unaware until his confession in 2019? The answers may never come. Dennis has proven himself a skilled liar, capable of maintaining deceptions for decades. And Brenda has chosen silence over truth. In the end, this is a story about identity, about a girl who had two names and two mothers, but never got the chance to define herself on her own terms. She was born Alexis Miranda Badger on June 23, 1974, to a 15-year-old mother who loved her enough to let her go, believing adoption would give her daughter the stability she couldn't provide. She became Aundria Michelle Bowman before her first birthday, raised by a couple who appeared stable and devout but harbored darkness behind closed doors. She disappeared on March 11, 1989, at age 14, when most girls are just beginning to discover who they want to become. She appeared in a music video in 1993 as a runaway, frozen in a school photograph with green eyes gazing upward, never knowing that she'd been in the ground since the day she vanished. She was identified through DNA in 2020 as remains buried in a backyard, reduced to bones and a candy wrapper dated 1989. Alexis never got to find her birth mother. Aundria never got to escape her adoptive father. The girl in the Runaway Train video never actually ran anywhere. She was stopped before she could even try. There's a tendency in true crime to focus on the killer, to analyze their psychology, to trace their pathology, to try to understand what makes someone capable of such horror. Dennis Bowman has received that attention in this narrative because understanding his pattern of violence is essential to understanding why Aundria died. But we owe the dead more than treating them as plot points in their killer's story. Aundria Bowman was more than a victim. She was a 14-year-old girl who played in the school band. She loved her baby sister enough to spend hours caring for her instead of living a typical adolescent life. She was brave enough to report her abuse to a teacher, reaching out for help even though she must have known the risk. She had green eyes and a face that would become familiar to millions who watched MTV in the 1990s, though they didn't know her name or her story. She had friends who searched for her, who wondered where she went, who never forgot her. Kathleen O'Brien Doyle was 25 years old, newly married to a Navy pilot, living with her orange tabby cat. She had friends who cared enough to check on her when she went silent. She deserved to grow old with her husband, to build the life they'd only just begun. Kathy Turkanian was a child herself when she made the impossible choice to surrender Alexis, believing adoption would give her daughter advantages she couldn't provide. She spent decades wondering if she'd made the right decision, then learned the horrifying truth that her sacrifice led not to safety but to tragedy. She fought for justice even when the system told her she had no right to, even when investigators dismissed her theories, even when she had no legal standing. She never stopped being Aundria's mother. These are the people we should remember. Not just as characters in Dennis Bowman's story of violence, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose losses created holes that can never be filled. There's one more uncomfortable truth this case forces us to confront: the ways we all contribute to enabling predators through our collective choices to look away. When Aundria boarded the school bus with blood on her wrists, students whispered and speculated but didn't report it. When rumors circulated about Dennis's temper and control, neighbors chose to mind their own business. When Aundria told a teacher she was afraid to go home, the system accepted the Bowmans' denial without further investigation. When Dennis was convicted in 1980 of assault with intent to commit criminal sexual conduct, when a judge determined he would pose a danger to women if free, he served only the minimum sentence. When he was caught in 1998 breaking into a woman's trailer with a bag containing her stolen underwear and a weapon, character references from his church helped him receive 1 year in jail. Father Michael O'Connell wrote that sending Dennis to prison would be a grave disservice to the church and the community. He was wrong. The grave disservice was allowing Dennis to walk free while presenting himself as a devoted father and community member. Every time someone chose to believe Dennis's facade over investigating further, they gave him permission to continue. Every time someone prioritized maintaining appearances over asking difficult questions, they enabled his violence. This doesn't mean those people are responsible for Dennis's crimes. He alone chose to rape, to murder, to bury his daughter in the backyard. But it means we have a collective responsibility to create systems and communities where predators can't hide behind respectability, where children who report abuse are believed and protected, where prior violence is taken seriously rather than forgiven. Aundria asked for help. The system failed her. We can't bring her back, but we can honor her memory by building something better. Somewhere in Michigan, there's a mother who gave up her daughter hoping for a better life and spent 30 years wondering if she'd made the right choice. Now she knows the answer, and it's the worst one imaginable. Somewhere in Virginia, there's a widow whose husband died never knowing what happened to his young bride, whose murder went unsolved for nearly 40 years while her killer walked free, raised a family, and pretended to be a good man. Somewhere in Michigan, there's a daughter who grew up not knowing her sister was buried in the backyard, who has to reconcile loving a father with knowing he's a monster. And somewhere in the DNA databases and missing persons files and cold case folders, there are likely other names we don't yet know, other women who crossed paths with Dennis Bowman and didn't survive, whose families still search for answers. This is what violence does. It doesn't just end lives, it radiates outward in waves that never stop, touching everyone connected to the victim, altering the course of countless other lives, creating empty places at tables that will never be filled. Aundria Bowman should be 49 years old today. She should have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, built a career, fallen in love, possibly had children of her own. She should have had the chance to search for her birth mother if she wanted to ask Kathy the questions that adoptees carry their whole lives. Instead, she's frozen at 14 in a photograph, a girl with green eyes looking slightly upward, captured in a moment before everything ended. Her name was Alexis. Her name was Aundria. She mattered. She deserved better. And we owe it to her memory to remember not just how she died, but that she lived, and that her life, however brief, had value that no amount of violence could erase.